Thanks very much. So thank you very, very much for the invitation to speak today, and thank you to the audience for hanging around for what is going to be the best talk of the entire morning. I guarantee that. So I was introduced as an experimental psychologist. Are there any other psychologists in the room? Please raise your hand. None. Sociologists? Anthropologists? Economists? Yeah, I'm usually the only one in the room. And I want to start off saying that's a problem. We keep hearing, we heard in every talk this morning, we need to understand how consumers actually use products. We need to understand how they think about these things. Where are the behavioral scientists at IAFP? And where are they on your staffs? If we're going to do quality assurance, if we're going to do food safety, you need behavioral scientists advising you at every step, beginning with the risk assessment stage. All right, so now I've lectured you. Now I'm going to try to entertain you a little bit. All right, so I was asked to talk about risk perception, which is my area of expertise. And we start off, I'm going to try to tell you some things or remind you of some things that you already know so that you'll shake your heads saying, yes, that's right, so that I can convince you that the other things that you don't know are actually right as well. So to understand how to influence people in terms of risk, we need to understand how they perceive risk. On the first day of graduate school in psychology, my professor said, perception is reality. It really doesn't matter what people, it doesn't really matter what the science says, it's what people think the science says, or what people, think is reality that is going to influence their beliefs, their attitudes, and their actions. The good news is that we know a lot about this. There is a science of risk perception and risk communication. I'm pleased to be part of a new book on the science of science communication put out by Oxford University Press that just came out, where we look in depth at risk perception and science communication issues. We publish in journals the science communication, public understanding of science, of course, risk analysis, many of you also read. There is a literature, there is a good science here. We need to use that science to improve risk assessment and risk management. Gone are the days, Don Zink this morning said, the wonderful thing about science is that sometimes the things that you think are logical just don't work out that way. We're beyond the point where we just go with our hunches about how consumers think about these things and how they act. There is a science of this. Now, one of the things that the science tells us is that the public is predictably irrational, right? We know that their perceptions are often inaccurate, but they're rarely completely irrational. Completely irrational means sort of random, illogical, or absurd. Now, I will argue that people's actions may be inconsistent and ultimately maybe not in their own best interests, but they're predictable. They act in predictable ways, and we know from the science of risk perception how to predict how people are going to act in ways that may not be in their best interests. So one of the things that I hear from CEOs, I do a fair amount of consulting work, is, if I just don't understand it, the public, why doesn't the public get that life is not risk-free? That in order to have benefits, they have to take on some additional risk. And my response is, actually, the public does know that life is not risk-free. We take on risks all the time. That said, they don't want any more risk. And frankly, they don't want any more of your risk. They don't want to take on any more risk that they're not in control of, and where there is not a specific benefit to them that they can plainly see. Why do they want any more risk? The other thing is that people expect you to continually work towards zero risk. So they know that you may never get there, but they want you to keep trying, right? One of the things that we deal with in risk perception, risk communication is what we refer to as meta messages. So there are the things that you are trying to say, and then there are the things that people hear. So when you talk about acceptable risk, and you talk about reducing foodborne illness by 10,000 cases. Are we going from 60,000 to 50,000 cases? What people actually hear is 50,000 cases of foodborne illness in this, related to this pathogen seems acceptable to you. Woohoo! 10,000 less cases of foodborne illness. But what people are hearing is 50,000 cases is acceptable. And if you or your grandmother or your infant is one of those cases and has a severe consequence, there are moral issues related to that. So what the public expects is for you not to say, well, we can't go we can't reduce it by another 10,000 cases. It wouldn't be, cost acceptable or that's cost prohibitive. 50,000 cases is the best we can do. What they're hearing is that you think that 50,000 cases of illness are just fine. And you don't mean that, but that's what people are hearing. So we need to be really, really careful about how we talk about this. So people don't want additional risks. And the other thing is that they don't want you to determine what acceptable risk is for them. They want to determine that for themselves. So just a little bit more rant, and then I'll move on. So one of the things that bothers me is I come to many, many meetings, not just IAFP, but other risk issues, and inevitably somebody gets up who looks a lot like me, who's an older white guy in a khaki pants and white shirt and a blue blazer, who says, well, the solution to this really is we just need to educate the public. We need to do a better job in the schools. We need to educate the public better. And the problem is that persuasion, getting people to take action, requires more than education, right? I hear this all the time. If people just understood the facts, they'd do the right thing. We wouldn't have a problem. We could have a rational discussion. They'd reach the right conclusion, and everything would be fine. And frankly, if they just understood the facts, there'd be no big deal, right? This is a really attractive idea to those of us in the sciences, right? Because we think that everybody should, act based on the same kind of information. And there are lots of people who've written about the problem with what's referred to as the educational deficit model, which is, people don't know the facts, and so the solution is to educate them. But we know from behavioral research that the correlation between what people know and what people do is generally less than 0.2, which is essentially non-existent. But frankly, we also know it from our own personal lives. People know the facts about drinking and driving, about smoking, and yet they continue to smoke and they continue to drive. We know the implications of being overweight, but we continue to have poor diets. So we know this from our own personal lives, that simply giving people more facts doesn't necessarily lead them to the right conclusions or the right behaviors. Why? Well, because providing facts rarely meets an individual's specific needs, wants, or expectations. We talk about the public. In fact, there is no such thing as the public. There are multiple publics. Marketers know this. That's how they're selling your products. The educational efforts that we engage in also often assume a base level of knowledge that does not exist. So we do studies on the behalf of USDA and CDC and FDA on what Americans know about germs, about agriculture, about food, and they know very, very little. So we tend to start at a level which is too high for most Americans. We also assume a base level of interest in the details of the science that frankly does not exist. So we've had a couple of receptions at IAFP. What's the worst thing that you can ask someone at one of these receptions? What do you do? And why? Because they will tell you in excruciating detail what they do. We do the same thing to the public. We expect them to be really, really interested in the science that we're engaged in, when what they really want to know is your impact, right? What is it essentially that you're trying to achieve? They don't want the details, right? So based on the science of science communication, we also know that simple education, provision of the facts doesn't work because we engage in motivated reasoning. So we know this really, really well. We easily incorporate new information that's consistent with what we already think. We reject new information that is inconsistent with what we already think. And failing that, when we can't reject it outright, we will twist the new information in ways that makes it consistent with what we already believe. We are cognitively lazy, basically. All right? We try to maintain our previous thoughts, which of course means that the one way to actually get people to do what we want them to do is to get to them early before they've made up their minds. Now, we also know from the science of risk perception and risk communication that risk perception has two components. There is a cognitive component, which is how we think about these particular risks, and there is an affective component, sort of how we feel about these risks, right? We need to address both of these things. Many psychologists, and especially the economists I tend to work with, believe that affect or emotion or feeling is a byproduct of cognition. That is the way they think this works, is that people evaluate the information they're given, which leads to an overall affective reaction, fear, dread, concern, disgust, what have you, right? So people think first and then they feel. The problem with that, and with those economists, is that they've clearly never been in love. Right? Because if you thought first, all right, well, so it's pretty clear that affect can come first, right? It seems clear that affect can drive future cognition. First impressions matter. You know, we know about gut decision making. Cyclical thinking, I like it because it's good, and it's good because I like it. There is no reason there. There is just, you know, a feeling. It's important to note that much of the advertising around food relies on affect and not cognition. Many of the activist messages also rely on affect. You can laugh at that slide, that's okay. You know what it means. The problem, of course, is that nutrition education relies on cognition and not affect. And food safety information also relies on cognition and not affect. Which is easier to market, affect or cognition? Ask your marketing department if you don't know the answer to that, right? So basically, risk perception is a mix of facts and feelings, intellect and instinct, reason and gut reaction. And in many cases, it's the feelings, instinct, and gut reaction that has the greater influence. So when we're thinking about doing risk communication, we have to address both of those things. Now, I do a lot of work around risk assessment and risk perception around a lot of different issues. And in my experience over the last 29 years at Rutgers, I can tell you that food risks are very, very different. I think you know this implicitly. But let's sort of walk through very quickly one of the things, or some of the things that make food risks different. Well, one is we all have to eat, and we all have to eat every day. Some of us several times a day. So one of the issues is that we have this belief that we are what we eat, right? This goes back to actually to 1825. And because we think of ourselves as you are what you eat, we both literally and figuratively internalize the risks that we perceive related to food and drink, right? We reinforce this idea, both in terms of health, so don't eat junk food because you are what you eat, and here's a positive, you are what you eat, and today I was awesome, you're better on beef. We actually use this in our marketing campaigns, because this is a culturally acceptable idea. The problem, of course, is that because we internalize them, potential food hazards, perceived hazards, are seen as objects of disgust. So for many people, consuming impure foods results in both an unclean body and an unclean spirit. Food carries cultural meaning, distinct religious, symbolic, and cultural meanings that just set it apart from many other concerns. We use our food choices to signify our identity, so who we are as individuals. Here's your vegan t-shirt. The question, of course, is, how can you tell if someone is a vegan? You don't have to, they'll tell you. That's certainly the case in my university. Here is the meat eater t-shirt to go along with that. People express their political or ideological beliefs based on their food choices. This is from a website, Peace, Love, Organic Mom. Meta message, anyone? We use food choices to solidify or to communicate our roles and status in society and to solidify those. So, how we present food and knowing which utensil to pick up is a symbol of our status. There's going to be a quiz later on about what all of these glasses and things, utensils are for, and the kinds of foods that we serve to our guests and choose for ourselves and know how to eat. That would be caviar. We don't get a lot of that at the State University. That is an indication of our status. And increasingly, we are sharing what it is that we are eating with each other. So we are reinforcing these ideas, right? In an era of social media, we are sharing this information. Now, of course, these self-identities don't actually change simply because there's contrary scientific evidence available, right? So, we know consensus report after consensus report that genetically modified foods are as safe to eat as conventionally bred foods, but that science does not change underlying beliefs or self-identities, right? This self-identity is also reinforced by others. We have helpful friends and family. I live quite near Princeton, where many of my children's parents engage in what I would charitably call competitive parenting. Oh, really? You serve that to Muffy? Oh my. Yeah. And then there's the mommy mafia, basically, that try to get you to comport to their ideas of what safe foods actually are, and actually impose sanctions if you bring the wrong cupcake or any cupcake actually now, into school, right? Food carries emotional meaning. It's associated with love, nurturing, and intimacy, and is considered crucial to creating and maintaining bonds between people, which is why the adulteration or the perceived adulteration of food and drink is seen as a violation of that trust and the bonds between people. Again, not actual adulteration, perceived adulteration, right? Oh, you're not serving organic food this evening? Some foods also have symbolic value, more than nutritional value. They have symbolic value. So if we adulterate milk, it's more than just an adulteration of a food substance. It's an adulteration or a contamination of our ability to nurture our children, or the symbol of nurturing of children, and so forth. Of course, the messages that we have to deliver around food are complex as well. And it often involves, I talk about risk communication, it's actually risk-benefit communication. The messages around fish, for example, are quite complex. I was served as the chair of the FDA's Risk Communication Advisory Committee, where the question of what do we tell pregnant and nursing women about fish consumption came up. A very complex message. We want you to eat 2 servings or no more than 3 servings of fish per week, and we'd like you to choose from this list that are high in omega-3 and other fatty acids, but very low in methylmercury. That's an awfully difficult message to deliver. And of course, one of the things that I want you to keep in mind is that most of the risks and the benefits that we're actually concerned about are invisible. They're invisible to the consumer, right? That's my one special effect. There you go. So what's the problem of invisibility for food safety? Well, one thing is that we often rely on visual and olfactory cues to know what's safe to eat and what's not safe to eat. So we have great data that suggests that many, many Americans, went on without me, believe that if it looks clean, it must be clean. I can't see the bacteria, they must not be there. Most Americans also don't know that there are spoilage bacteria and pathogenic bacteria, and they're not the same. And even if they do know that, they don't know that spoilage bacteria are not a reliable indicator of pathogenic bacteria. And that's why the sniff test is not adequate, right? People don't know this. So the key thing is, because most of the things we're concerned about are invisible, without these particular cues, it's really easy for people to either ignore or to amplify the real risks. They tend to ignore the risks when they're in control. They tend to amplify the risks when you're in control, as the food industry. We also know from data we collected for CDC that most Americans know very little about foodborne illness. They underestimate the incidence of foodborne illness. They're unable to identify the people particularly at risk for foodborne illness. They cannot themselves identify the symptoms, and as a result, it's not surprising that they do not recognize foodborne illness when they personally experience it. The CDC estimates that 1 in 6 Americans will get sick this year from foodborne illness. In our study in 2008, only 18% of Americans owned up to having foodborne illness at any time in their lives. That is a statistical improbability, okay? There is a lack of feedback loops because the bacteria are invisible. So because people don't necessarily aren't able to connect their behaviors with foodborne illness, very few believe that they have made themselves ill, ever, and even fewer believe they've made somebody else ill, right? So foodborne illness is usually blamed on somebody else. And who is that? You folks, right? Or the last thing that they ate, right? Not the expensive steaks that they got, in a package, but the tuna fish sandwich that they had at the cafeteria, right? So because of this lack of feedback loop, people don't connect their actions with the consequences. This is a problem for home cooks. It's also a problem for food service and food preparation, right? Because if you take a shortcut and you never see the consequences, what's to keep you from taking that shortcut again? Nothing. Of course, people don't know what they don't know. Our studies for the USDA show that Americans at least, overestimate both their knowledge of science and agriculture. And with increasing urbanization, it means fewer people around the world are actually involved with agriculture. They don't know how the agriculture system has changed. And the key thing is, because they don't know what they don't know, they're unlikely to ask the right questions, or any questions at all, or sit still for your educational efforts, because they think they already know. Now, why should they know? We've disconnected them from agriculture. So fewer than 2% of Americans live on a farm or a ranch. An additional 1% are hired farm labor. That's about 3% of Americans who are directly involved with agriculture. Our surveys show that people who live in cities think they know more about food and agriculture than people who actually live in agricultural areas, right? But why should they know? We've disconnected them from agriculture. So here's the Angus beef chart. When I was a kid, this was up on the wall next to the in-store butcher, right? There is no in-store butcher anymore in many stores. And this chart has gone away. What you actually see are packages of meat put out in the case. And there is no connection as to where those pieces of meat came from to an actual animal, which is why surveys in the US and the UK suggest that many children, for example, don't know that ham comes from pigs. We've also sanitized food. We put things in plastic packages. We refer to this as the cellophane effect. And because these things are triple washed and so forth, we've basically trained people to think that all produce, in particular, is ready to eat, particularly organic produce, because it's perfectly safe. Food safety education is broken. We're not doing that very well. We know that many Americans, particularly young Americans and young men, are watching these competitive cooking shows. And in the Ivan Parkin lecture, we saw another picture of this. People are really getting models of very bad behavior. We're not producing recipes in meal kits or anything else that engage consumers with proper cooling, storage, or reheating instructions. So the big thing about invisibility is invisibility for most consumers means a loss of control. And when something is out of our control, it feels much more risky. This plays a very prominent role in arguments by proponents of GMO labeling, for example. And this sign sort of says it all. So what people try to do when they feel out of control is to maintain the illusion of control through a variety of means. So one of the things we see is the misuse of date labeling. Our data and the data of others shows that people, when they see sell by October 14th, actually think that they should discard it by October 15th, that something magic happens in the bottle that makes it, immediately unsafe. And so we end up wasting a lot of food because people are using this date label as a way to try to control what they perceive to be a risk. They're wrong, but it's an indication that they're trying to maintain this idea of control. Why do people buy organic? Our data suggests so that they can eliminate risks in their lives, right? They can eliminate pesticide risk, for example. They're wrong. 100% natural, same sort of thing. I'm buying natural, it therefore must be safe. Somehow, depending on your theological bent, God, Gaia, whatever is the ultimate regulator. If it's natural, it must therefore be safe. We're seeing an increase in clean label. Again, as an indication, if it's got a small number of ingredients and ingredients that I can recognize and pronounce, it must therefore be safe. This is an illusion of control. We're seeing an increase in the number of products with real ingredients, right? Made with real fruit, real honey, real sugar, real white chocolate, real milk. And of course, made with real ingredients, which I think is the ultimate real. I'm not sure what the alternative is. Metaphysical ingredients, perhaps. So the key thing is when the risks are perceived to be invisible, people are open to a number of simple heuristics like natural and organic and so forth. This is from Michael Pollan's book, Food Rules. Eat organic, whole foods are best. Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. Simple heuristics that create a simplified set of rules for people. Let's face it, there's a lot of confusing information out there, and so they're open to these particular rules. There are no shortage of food rules. This is just a collection from Amazon, but go on the internet and you'll find a plethora of these kinds of rules. This is actually my favorite rule. This is from Michael Pollan. Don't eat breakfast cereals that change the color of the milk. I have not seen the risk assessment behind that. I'm not sure there is one, but here's the thing. It sounds right. And these rules just depend on intuitive plausibility. It just has to sound plausible for a significant number of people to follow it. And no one's going to go to the internet and look this up and look for countervailing information. It makes sense, right? So there's no shortage of expert advice. You know about the Food Babe. You know about Dr. Oz. They have large audiences. Their lies and the lies of others only have to be plausible to be accepted. I'm going to pass on that and say this, that Mark Twain said a lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is putting on its shoes, and he wrote that before the invention of the internet, right? So we are able to spread this quite easily. We know that people learn about risks through implicit comparisons suggesting superiority. You're familiar with these packaging messages. We charge more for these foods for what's not in them, communicating to consumers that these are things that they should avoid. So should we be surprised when people are concerned about these kinds of invisible risks when essentially we're marketing products based on those risks? So basically advertising claims introduce risks that people have never heard before. This is my favorite. Great cheese comes from happy cows. I have to now worry about the mental health of the dairy cattle. And then I saw this book, which indicates that there are, in fact, no happy cows. So I don't know what to really make of that. So let me cut to the chase here. Moving forward, we have to carefully consider the messages that we're sending through product claims. We need to adopt strategies that make the invisible visible for consumers as a way to cue precautionary behaviors that are appropriate. We can create nudges that lead consumers to make the right choices. And we need to, create ways to help consumers ritualize their behaviors so that they become automatic in the face of hazards they cannot see. We need to enhance the packaging and give explicit instructions about what to do and why. So if a sell-by date or a best-by date should indicate to consumers what they should do with the product after that date is reached, not simply indicate what the date is. We should be providing links to appropriate online videos and other instructional materials, take advantage of where our customers are, food-oriented television, online blogs, YouTube channels, and other opportunities to reach consumers. So that is my presentation. If you have complaints, this is where you can reach me, and I will be around for lunch. Thank you.
Anybody have one question?
Compliments to the organizers of this session. It was really great. And I have a question that I wish I could ask to a panel, but you're the last one up, so you get it. If you look at the risk, Katie Swanson, consultant, if you look at the risk analysis paradigm, risk assessment, risk management, and risk communication, and the resources that are put against that in the area of food safety.
Right.
Where does risk communication fall? And
by the wayside.
Yeah, on the low end of the scale. And it would be interesting to have a panel on where do you get the biggest bang for the buck.
Absolutely.
If those resources were
Absolutely.
Do you want to comment on that?
So sure. So where does risk communication fall? At the very bottom. It's typically seen as a translational activity. We'll do the risk assessment, we'll figure out what to do, and then we'll hire somebody to try to explain it to the audience. And so it comes at the end. Virtually no money is given to it. My great frustration right now is USDA, where I was able to successfully obtain money to create the statistics that I cited here, really is not funding standalone risk communication or risk perception research anymore. So it's really difficult to get the basic research dollars to really move this forward. And I don't know where it's going to come from. Thank you very much.
Thank you.